Welcome, everyone. There's people online. Hello to everyone online, and thank you for joining. I hope you had a good lunch. So this is the Persistent Identifier Interest Group, PID and today's topic is all about equity and inclusion, but I'll come to that in a moment. We have four co-chairs. My name is Jonathan Clark. Sitting in the front here is Laurie Haag. Adrian Burton sadly couldn't join us. He had to go back to Australia, and Nabuko Miyari is online, so you can wave to her virtually. Actually, Miyari, can we hear you? Are you allowed to speak? Okay, yes. I was going to get her to introduce herself, but I think we're still figuring out how we can do that on Zoom. So here's the agenda for today. It's fairly packed, so we're going to move it quickly. Just a quick introduction shortly for those of you who are new to the Persistent Identifier group, and then an introduction to this meeting, why the topic, an update on a meeting that happened in between plenaries that I think is useful to reflect on. And then today we're focusing on Africa to start with, two presentations, which actually we've decided to flip. So Chiamo is going to speak and then Joy. And then we're going to hear about two global access initiatives. And then I'd quite like a discussion. I don't know how that will go and how it will go online, but we'll see if we can have a discussion on what we've learned from the speakers and what we can do as an interest group or as PID providers to do better on equity and inclusion. There's also a poll, and I'll talk to that in a second. First of all, very important, collaborative notes. They're online. You can check the link in the chat, which Laurie is going to put in if you're online, or you can scan this QR code to go to the collaborative notes, or you can link there from the program. It is really important to do, please, for two reasons. One is it is good to track who's involved, so that if we have any outcomes of this meeting, I can send them to you directly by email. Secondly, it's really helpful for people that weren't able to attend that there are some notes in there, and if we do that collaboratively, and not just me or our co-chairs, then that works really well. You can also start the discussion there if you wish. And we've set up a Mentimeter poll that's live right now to ask you a bit about your opinion of the interest group, and that's live. There's a link in the collaborative notes, and that's kind of like a teaser, so you actually go to the collaborative notes to find the link. Okay. Quick introduction to the, are all of you familiar with Persistent Identifier Interest Group, or are there some newcomers? Some newcomers, great. So it's all about persistent identifiers, and in the broadest sense, we believe as a group that they're foundational. And what I mean by that is that they just underpin everything we do. You have to know what's what and where to find it, and then you can build on top of that. And I think all of you know that, but it's sometimes good to just remember that or at least we consider it to be foundational. It's the start of what everything else is built on top. And so it has to work well and be spread as widely across the world as possible. So what did the interest group do? Well, it's a place to go to share identifier-related efforts. Particularly in the beginning, we did a lot of that, saying, well, this person's doing this, here's someone else doing that. We exchange information, questions, answers, and information around persistent identifiers. It's an opportunity to ask any related questions, either now or afterwards or in between the plenaries. And the fourth thing we do, and that we've done that in the last few plenaries, is to take an important or emerging issue that's particularly related to persistent identifiers. And we've looked at persistence, what does that mean? And today, that's the background for today's focus on sort of the global picture. Make sense? Good at the back? Yep, great. Just there was a group, so RDA, partly for their anniversary, and I think partly also to try and get an idea of what's going on. They invited, there are currently three working groups or interest groups with persistent identifiers. There used to be PID instruments, but they've delivered. So there's a national PID strategy working group, working with PIDs and tools interest group and ourselves. And we got together in a workshop earlier this year, and I'll post the link in the collaborative notes to the report. And I think some of you who are here were there too. And the outcomes were kind of interesting for me or for us as co-chairs, because there sort of was a general feeling of you should do more of what you do. And I wondered quite whether that meant that we're not doing it well enough. And so that's partly the reason for the poll at the end today, or you can do it now, is are we really delivering what you want? Or is there something else we should be doing or more as an interest group? So the outcomes were, we need to gather use cases and applications. Well, I think we all do that. Share success stories. You'll hear some of that today. Identify communications experts or community managers to communicate the value of PIDs. It's an interesting one. And more focus on information exchange. And it was that last one that kind of got me thinking, are we doing enough as an interest group in that respect? So I just wanted to share that with you as food for thought. Today's session. So last week, actually, I was at I have several things that I do, but last week I was in Madrid at a conference for medical oncology, huge conference. And there was a presentation by a WHO expert. And her presentation was all about how healthcare is incredibly not equitable. So inequitable is the word, I think, inequitable across the world. And particularly with reflection to cancer and cancer survival. And her presentation was full, it was a plenary, and it was full of data, just full of data backing up what she was saying and why we needed to act. And of course, we all know that, but I just thought, well, yeah, of course, data underpins the decision-making of governments in policy, of healthcare. It tries to make the world healthier. And this just, for me, kind of was another reminder of how important it is. And that's obviously why we're here. But also that it needs to be not just us, it needs to be all the research and the effort going on in every continent in the world, and not just in Europe or America or in Asia, but in Africa, in the low and middle income countries. And so it really highlighted for me that this is something we need to talk about. How do we better support initiatives from low and middle income countries to get them in at this foundational level, to be able to generate the data, share it, and be part of the global world. And hopefully, well, if we can improve healthcare, that would be cancer outcomes, that would be good. So that's really the background for today's session. Quite a few years ago, this project, actually, Josh is here, he did help lead a project that spun out of Freya, which said, if there's one thing the persistent identifier community should do, what is it? And the answer was be more inclusive worldwide. And we struggled afterwards saying, well, how do we do that? This is just another way maybe of asking the same question, but it is something that's on our mind. And that's the background. Does it make sense? Great, thank you. And thank you for coming. So that was my start. We're going to, this says we're going to Joy. We're actually not. We're going to, oops, sorry. Oh, it's in the wrong order. I have to figure this out. We're going to Tiamo first, and then we're going to flip back. So I need to go down. Okay, this is going to be the best way. Here you get a preview of what Joy is going to say. Quick. Great. It's actually a different person, you'll notice, because we had some interesting issues getting everyone online. So I'd like to welcome Tiamo to the podium. I've got a little intro for him. He's the director of African Open Science Platform, which is what we're going to hear about. He's based at the National Research Foundation of South Africa, and his background is in computer science. And he just told me that he's an accomplished martial arts.
Stay safe. Yeah?
An accomplished martial arts expert.
In the good old days. Yeah? In the good old days. Please. No, so thanks, Jonathan. Jonathan wanted to know anything peculiar about me. I did explain to him that I did do martial arts for many years. I remember I did an internship at British Energy in Lancashire, and I used to go training with the local club, and eventually I did some tournaments, and I was nearly inducted into the UK team. Yeah. Then I said, no, I'm from Botswana. I cannot possibly represent your country. So really today is a great pleasure because I was drafted in last minute to come and engage on Professor Wafula's behalf. Those who know him, he's a tall, dark, elegant man with better suits than I am. But he represents the African Open Science Platform, East African Node. I want to emphasize this because AOSP is a Pan-African project that sees us developing different nodes in different parts of the continent. And I so happen to have the pleasure of being the director based at the NRF in South Africa as the coordinating hub for this very, very exciting project. We will have nodes all over Africa. At the moment, we have 3 nodes. one in East Africa that Professor Wafula's presentation is about primarily, and then the other in Egypt to represent the North African part of the continent. And then we have the Southern African node represented by the Ubuntu Net Alliance, which is the network of NRENs in East Africa and Southern Africa. You see where this is going. I normally show this map of Africa to show how huge it is. So it's quite unfortunate that we don't have many Africans here, but I'm hoping that in IDW 2027, Jonathan, when it comes to South Africa, we'll change this picture, isn't it? So I thought maybe I should just use this opportunity not to miss the presentation by Professor Wafula, if only to showcase maybe some of the efforts that are in the continent. So really, that is the spirit where this is coming from. I think Prof. Wafula has asked to share a little bit about some of the open science initiatives in the continent. You recall that I think I was in Gothenburg last year where we shared about ASP. There was a very detailed landscape study done prior to actually constituting ASP. We are going through the process, at least as one of the initial activities of these nodes, to augment that study with activities across various pillars of open science that are happening in the various parts of the continent. I think if you go to the ASP website, asp.org.za, you'll see the ASP strategy, very detailed document that is evolved obviously based on the work that was done on the landscape study, but that's the vision. You know, the platform aims to position African scientists at the cutting edge of data-intensive science with all that it entails. And I normally showcase a slide to show that we're an open science diplomacy platform. I want to stimulate interactivity, we want to maximize impact, we want to coordinate, we want to make sure that we harness those capacities that we have to do better and do more things. I think Professor Wafula wanted to share these objectives. I think platforms like these allow us to showcase what we're about, and for those that are doing similar work, to find ways they can plug in with us. I did say yesterday that the pinnacle of my visit was the panel discussion on the sustainability hubs. I see very good synergies. Everybody's talking about transformational science, talking about multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and I think it's critical for us in the various continents and the various countries to be configured appropriately. So sometimes it's about configuration. Women often lament funding, but the question is sometimes, are you configured to do things? So I think it's very, very important to get this right. And of course, we also want to make sure that we showcase African research, of which there is a lot. And the issue of data, the data is there, but is it accessible? What can we do more to showcase the work that is being done in Africa and the value of data that is there? I think in the session that I was at, I showcased the work that is done on the African AU data policy, primarily because the policy is looking at the potential for digital transformation and the digital economy in the continent. So there is a lot of work done in that space, but of course we need to do more when it comes to the issue of research data management. Colleagues, I want to share these as the key objectives for ASP, obviously translated by Professor Wafula in those words. And I did mention that we have a regional model. We've got a regional, we've got a hub and spoke model. I want to emphasize this because often for a large continent like ours, you cannot claim to represent everybody. We had a very, very good process for establishing these nodes. There was a very robust criteria in the call. There's a detailed call that we issued internationally to solicit those that can represent ASP nodes. And there were very key areas that we wanted them to hit. One of which will be institutions that have got leverage, including with policymakers. They've got competencies in certain areas, but they also maintain large networks themselves in terms of collaborations. You'll see there the Egyptian National Authority on Remote Science, Remote Sensing and Space Sciences. Space sciences represent very good potential for socioeconomic development across board. And we wanted an institution that can maybe, especially given the African Space Agency and the African Space Strategy, that we can leverage for some of these things. The second one is the institution where Professor Wafula is hosted. He's at Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture. I think Joy comes from Kenya. She knows very well about that institution. Kenya is doing fantastic work with agriculture. And we have ICAD there, which is the African Institute of Capacity Development, focusing on capacity development, especially on poverty reduction and related issues. You'll agree that this is paramount when it comes to transformational science. We do have the Ubuntu Net Alliance. It's a huge network of national education research networks doing fantastic work, connecting universities, connecting the relevant stakeholders using high-speed connectivity, and doing good work with JONT in Europe regarding improving accessibility of infrastructure. We see them as the potential to support open science in the continent through infrastructure, developing the research computing infrastructure we need computationally, and African Research Cloud, very, very critical, and we think they're best placed to do that. A little bit about the East African node. We've given Latitude as the coordinating hub for ASP to these nodes to do the work that you see there. They'll be very responsible themselves in their jurisdictions to coordinate all aspects, as you can see there. I think Professor Wafula has given you the link to ICAD, if you totally want to also have a quick look at what they do. He's also shared a little bit on the open science initiatives in the continent, of which there are many, by the way. And the landscape study that I talked about was published in 2018, detailed document, but 2018 is 5 years away, 5 years back. A lot has since happened. So we're going through an exercise where all the African regional nodes are now will be updating that knowledge base with activities so that one day when you come, you click on the ASP, you'll be seeing what's happening in the continent. You'll be able to come to us and say, look, I want to know more about this. But there it is. There's a lot happening in the continent. We just need to make sure that that is visible and accessible. And of course, we can do joint programming with some of you who've been doing some of this work. I think we also, in this particular slide, Professor, if we wanted to showcase some of the key projects, just some, it's not many. We know that areas like genomics are critical areas. Africa is the most genetically diverse continent, as you know. It's surprising. It is linguistic diversity, genetic diversity. It's not uncommon to have in one country over 100 languages. What that means that underneath there is also the diversity of genomics. There's some good projects that happened over the past couple of years. One of them, History Bionet, History Africa, that has since been followed up by the very good response to the NIH call to develop a data science platform for genomics, led by Professor Mulder in Cape Town. So really areas like this, I think, provides a very good opportunity to look at some of these data issues, infrastructure issues, as they pertain to the data emanating from those projects. And I think also in terms of biodiversity, you see some examples there. I've got colleagues from South Africa. South Africa is doing fantastic work, including having roadmaps for research infrastructures, including for areas like biodiversity, marine, environmental observation networks. Of course, all these things generates a lot of data. Data First is also highlighted there as one of the few core trust seal awarded databases in terms of the continent. I cannot emphasize enough, projects like the Square Kilometer Array provides a very good conduit for exercising all aspects of open science in the continent. Remember, this is the largest science project ever. In terms of developing the instrumentation for astrophysics, astronomy. And the first phase of this is in the Karoo in South Africa as Meerkat. We see this as a potential to really promote open science. And of course, there are other areas, including indigenous knowledge. There were some presentations this week about indigenous knowledge. And I often said, I think it's very, very important to have some of these communities represented here. Quickly, colleagues, Professor Wafula wanted to share what, at least in Kenya, is happening. This is reflected across the continent to showcase maybe at that particular country, what are the bases for maybe supporting developments in open data. You'll see there that he's talking from a constitutional point of view. There's elements of the constitution that talks to elements of citizens' right to access information. And then it takes it further down in terms of the Access to Information Act. And then, of course, then it takes down to institutional level. This is a very important slide because I think every country in a way has got elements of this. Can we then maybe use these as a basis for developing maybe robust open science policies that are progressive? I think he also wanted to highlight some activities, at least from his university, in terms of what they're trying to do. Their Open Data Science Initiative at JKUT. And I think these are important initiatives at a very low level at the nodes. Remember, universities are different. Some are well-resourced, some are not. But in every sphere of the continent, I think in schools, in the universities, let's do the best we can, at least in terms of awareness. There was also a little bit of study done by the 13 Science Granting Council Initiative. These are the science granting councils in various countries in terms of exploring what are the key drivers that can contribute socioeconomic development as far as open science is concerned. I think the similar exercise that was done in yesterday's panel showcased things like capacity development as key, isn't it? You saw how that percolated upwards. So some sort of assessment was done in terms of some of those areas, and I think the results are shown there. And Professor Wafula wanted to share some of the institutions leading open science practices in Kenya. Again, remember, it's a very large continent. Any of these is also happening else. So Jonathan, I got 30 seconds. Yeah, 14 minutes 24. Did I spend 14 minutes talking? Okay, 5 minutes. That's fine. That's fine. So a table like this is reflective of what a country like Kenya is doing. The same way for Tanzania, the same for Somalia, the same for Botswana. How many countries are there? We want to make sure we've got a knowledge base to do this. I think in the other session, I showcased our ASP policy tracker in terms of what we're trying to do. I'm sure Joy can also take off some of these things. Education is important. All those materials that we collate, whether it's in data stewardship, whether it's in the policies, training, where is it? Can we have a network of information, network of training, which is one of the pillars that ASP has? So really, we are looking to create a network for capacity building. Professor Wafula just wanted to showcase in his sphere what they are trying to do. Institutional repositories. I think there was a study done, and is Louise here? There was a study done a little bit on this. You also know there was a conference this year in Stellenbosch, wine capital of Africa. Is it Stellenbosch or Cape Town? Yeah, which is which? Is it? I did do some wine tours. I took a car. I didn't drink much, but I just visited a couple of them. Yeah, Stellenbosch University hosted the Open Repositories Conference this year. I was there, one of the panel, one of the keynotes. Very important conference. Professor Wafula is very proud of the statistic that 32% of repositories in Africa in Kenya. So really, just to showcase institutionally, you'll see that agriculture is a key area also for Kenya. And I think it represents a very good opportunity for the sustainability hub that we talked about. He also shared a little bit about open access. Everybody's talking about this. A lot of countries are also discussing how they can engage in this space, particularly given that you all agree that science has to be a public good. Yeah. We know that there's a conversation that is going on. I was at the United Nations in February at the UN Open Science Conference, where we all agreed that this is the trajectory we need to go through. But maybe getting there may be a different challenge. Very quickly, Jonathan, there was some work as a prelude to African Open Science Platform on highlighting maybe an open science policy framework. I was at the SADC ministers meeting in June in DRC, where they actually made pronouncements of how ASP, UNESCO, and the SADC Secretariat can develop a regional platform for open science. So there are elements that goes into that. I think Professor Wafula wanted to showcase the policy statements, what is the necessary enabling practices, and who needs to do what in that area. Prof, as I wrap up, he also wanted to showcase some key projects. Now that we are talking about data, and I think in my plenary session, in my other session, I shared very quickly about the potential for creating a network of climate change, disease modeling, and the necessary networks you need to create through some calls. You know, there's potential through the welfare project to be able to work with communities of practice to address issues like interoperability. So pretty much that is the presentation that was shared, and it's only a drop in the ocean. I have to emphasize that the scale of the project that we have ahead of us is exciting, but there's also so much you can learn from the communities here. We are developing working groups, including on data. We're working to develop a data science and AI institute. We're also worried about data publishing. We're also worried about data policies. So indeed, our working groups can work very closely with some of you. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you. We have time for a question if there's one or two. I don't know. Let's see if there's, yep, there's a question. Matt has a question.
Yeah, I'd keep it be. That's very interested in, I think this is a global challenge around how do we create the right incentives for researchers? Yeah. If we ask a researcher now, and I look at South Africa as an example, the DHET lists, like publish in a top journal, you get money. And this is not South Africa, it's global. How much change has there been in Africa in trying to incentivize kind of indigenous knowledge, data? And I think we also need to recognize it on a global scale. Often, if we take malaria research as an example, sometimes researchers will come into Europe from Europe into Africa, do research, produce data, go publish article, get the credit, get the funding. The researcher in Africa doesn't get the funding in the end because they didn't produce the paper. How do we change that? And are you seeing movement on that?
It's a good question. I'm going to interrupt you. It's a good question. I think we all agree. This is an area that needs to be addressed. I remember years ago when the World Intellectual Property Organization had to come up with creative instruments, including the geographical indications. I mean, if you're drinking Scotch whiskey, it is Scotch whiskey, isn't it? I cannot make one up and claim to be Scotch whiskey. So they had some interesting instruments to be able to help indigenous communities. So I think it's a very important issue that still needs to be addressed. I remember when I was at the SADC ministers meeting, they asked the same thing. What about our indigenous knowledge? What about the countries from the global north coming to Gazam all the data while we're still worried about how to organize ourselves? So I think these are pertinent issues that conferences like this need to come up with creative ways for doing it. I think we also talked about data colonialism the other day. And there are layers to this, isn't it? If you want to manage your data, you must invest in infrastructure, isn't it? Some countries are developing indigenous knowledge IP policies. First of all, you define what indigenous knowledge is, and then you have to define infrastructure where you actually collate it, so that if somebody claims that data, you say, no, we already have it here, and where did you get it? So really, it's a very good question, and I would like to see us move into a dispensation where we can have a global governance mechanism, where we also recognize the inequities, including how to address this. And so I'll be very, very happy with my new role as carrying the continent, how we can advance these issues. I'm very excited, Jonathan, about the possibility of maybe a tangible project, well-funded, that will then engage these communities in a concrete manner, bring them to the fore, and then discuss these pertinent issues with them in co-creation and co-design, maybe well-funded, maybe for 5 years, that ASP will be very happy to engage with, and then we see what comes out of it. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Helmo. So that mention of indigenous knowledge is a wonderful segue to our next speaker, Joy, and you'll hear all about it. You're quite privileged to be some of the first people to hear about the Africa PID Alliance. Joy is the Executive Director of the Training Center in Communication in Nairobi. She's also on the steering group of ROAR and International Science Council. Her background's higher educational management, but she's also, be careful, there's another one to be aware of. She's a competitive weightlifter. Really, and a mountaineer, but not at the same time. Joy.
Thank you. Thanks, Shyam, also as well for talking about why we need to protect our indigenous knowledge. And what I'll be taking you through is actually one of the solutions on how we can mitigate that challenge through the provision of persistent identifiers. And this is what the project is about. So the Africa PID Alliance is a project or an open infrastructure project of the Training Center in Communication. And what we are trying to do is come up with a multilinear object and identifier approach in using PIDs to build equity. So the vision of our project is to secure the future of African indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage and support African scientists and inventors to realize their research and innovations. In essence, the Africa PID Alliance intends to provide persistent identifiers for 3 areas that have been ignored, and I've seen Shyam talking about it: indigenous knowledge, cultural heritage, and also patent data. So in terms of indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage, the obvious bit is that it's a strong contributor to the research life cycle, and what we've been seeing is the research output. We've lost indigenous knowledge from a historical perspective, and we've also been continuously losing indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage from helicopter science aspect. And we felt that this is an area that needs to be worked on. And yes, we are very cognizant of the fact that it's extremely multi-layered, and that is one of the reasons why we're proposing a multilinear identifier to support this ecosystem. But what about patents? And I come from a continent that has been defined in 3 ways by the economist. At some point, we were called the dark continent, then followed by Africa Rising. These were literally the covers of the Economist. And about a few years ago, we were perceived as the Silicon Savannah, because all of a sudden they're seeing innovations coming out of Africa. But the irony of that is that even with the innovations that are coming out of Africa, only 10% of our patents are accessible globally, because in order for patents to be accessible globally, you have to have them filed in the IP5, the big IP5. Filing patents in the big IP5 is extremely expensive, and it is equivalent to the annual budget of a technical transfer office. So what you'll find is that patents are filed nationally and you still not see it globally. So the question is that what are they using to measure the fact that Africa is a Silicon Savannah? There's quite a bit of patent information that is not accessible. And the reality is that the metadata is the same, whether you file it at WIPO in any of the big IP5 or at a national patent agency. So it's an issue of cost, and we are trying to see how we can make this accessible, because it's accessible nationally, but it's not accessible continentally. So what is the Africa PID Alliance? We have the following launch partners who are supporting us. That is the Kenya Education Network. So that is an NREN based in Kenya, the Africa Academy of Sciences, the Association of African Universities. This is the umbrella body of all vice chancellors and vice chancellors in Africa, and the African Library Information Associations and Institutions, which is the umbrella body for librarians in Africa, because librarians / knowledge managers are going to be the primary recipients of this solution. And TCC Africa is the community engagement partner. So what we intend to do is we are going to be collating knowledge, as I said, indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage, processing it and making it accessible. That is our flow. But how do we intend to do this? In several ways. Having an African open PID infrastructure that leverages existing technology in order to ensure creation, storage, governance, and management of African research content. And the more we've been talking to stakeholders, we realized it's just not an African problem. It's something that we're seeing in the Global South. So this is a problem that we're seeing in the Global South. So this is a project potentially that recipients in the Global South will benefit from, or we could also collaborate with. We want to promote African content and output, and also connect African research output to citation analytical service providers, increase that visibility. We also want to build a community of early and mid-level careers in data science and AI in scholarly infrastructure. That is also another thing we noted. As much as all of us are talking about open science and open data, there's a really small pool of specialists in this. So this is one of the activities we are looking at. So we have an infrastructural component, and we also have a capacity building component. And of course, as we are fundraising, we are looking at various ways in which we are going to fundraise, both from industry partners and also from funders, in order to support any projects within the continent that will focus on sustainable approaches to capacity strengthening and also infrastructure development, as long as it's focusing on data management, data science, focusing on scholarly infrastructure. Going back to what I said, we have very few specialists in that area. Even amongst our librarians, not all of them are familiar with the open science scholarly infrastructure ecosystem, particularly when you're looking at persistent identifiers. So overall, we want to solve an African challenge by preserving African indigenous knowledge, innovation, and cultural heritage under a dedicated persistent infrastructure hosted in Africa, not only for Africa, but potentially to be shared globally, particularly in the Global South. So when we started, these are some of our partners who have been working with us. Some of them are international partners, some of them are local partners. I'd already mentioned the African partners, AFLIA, Africa Academy of Sciences, but globally you're seeing the RDA, the Donor Foundation, CNRI in the US, DOI Foundation, Crossref, and DataCite. Some of them are represented here. And we also have local contexts who have been supporting us in terms of the indigenous knowledge. So we also created an African PID Alliance traditional working group, and we started including some of the partners we are working with. And as you can see, we also have the Kenya Industrial Property Institute. So that is one of the national patent agencies, which also happens to house the Indigenous Knowledge and Cultural, National Indigenous Knowledge and Cultural Heritage Office for the country. So with more who are interested in joining the working group. So I was very interested in some of the presentations that Dr. Shiamo was saying, because you'd like to have this uniform conversation, especially on how we can protect our Indigenous knowledge through the provision of persistent identifiers. Now, in terms of the patents, it's the same partners, but in addition, we have ARIPO. So for context, back to what Shiamo said, it's a big continent. ARIPO is the umbrella body for 16 countries that have national patent registration agencies. And we're in the process of working with them in order to index or rather provide PIDs for the patents that have been produced within those regions. And also another thing that has come out as we are having the conversation on patent is the need to also look at trademarks and industrial designs, because there are more trademarks and more industrial designs than patents being produced. And that adds to the multilinear nature of how our PID is going to work. So I'll take you through that as well. So what are we putting on the table? So this is our technical offer. We have produced, it's going through product development, the digital object container identifier. And what it is that it is a multilinear identifier that can support various persistent identifiers, but also at the same time, we are looking at it from an object level and at an identifier level. From the object level, the reason why we ended up looking at this approach is because of the indigenous knowledge. By the time you have your research output, there are various layers of the contribution indigenous knowledge has done leading to the research output. So we felt we need to protect that entire process. And not all of them will need 10 dots. Some of them will need 20 dots. So having a container with all that is easy, so that when you're harvesting that information, you have a series of that. But then at the same time, we realized we're looking at the end user, the knowledge manager. Instead of them going to various service providers, we work with these service providers and we include those various identifiers. So in this case, whether they are ARC keys, RORs, DOIs, RAIDs, in one container, so that they can pick and choose and assign as to their needs. So making the whole process easy and accessible. As I said, this, for those of us who are in the persistent identifier community, this might seem like common sense, but until when you think from a user perspective, they are extremely overwhelmed by what is available there. So where are we right now? This is the current workflow of the digital object container. So we are looking at offering identifiers as a service when choosing digital content. So whether it is DOIs, digital object identifiers, or handles. And then this is interconnected as a service when choosing, and this interconnects different identifiers under one unique place, adding interoperability, persistence, discovery to local identities. And we want to make it easy to create, consolidate, register, and anchor identifiers under unique persistent digital identifier containers. So we are working with Codra for the digital object management, and we are working with Invenio for the research data management system. So this is where the user interface will be to help assign the various identifiers. So at the moment, what we are doing is that what you're seeing is a sample of what we have so far. So what we are working with is 20 dots, but as I said, we are in partnership discussions with DataCite and Crossref to make this even much more accessible beyond the 20 dots. So the DOCID registry is fed from the digital object IDs from CNRI using Codra, and multiple other IDs from different other object identifiers. So you end up having a multilinear approach to the different identifiers. So this is further at an object level. So this is what we are looking at. So at the end of the day, you're going to have different types of identifiers. So there's for people. So with ORCID, you're looking at organizations. So you're looking at ROR, and then you can have 20 dots or 10 dots for the various aspects of the objects. So as I said, this was really influenced by when we were looking at the nature of how indigenous knowledge contributes to research. Now, from the docket pool itself, if you look at the docket pool, this is the first draft of how it's going to work. And it's what we're looking at, users will obtain this identifier in the Invenio research data management platform, along with other related identifiers. And you can either register identifiers and include them under a docket or include this identifier under an existing docket. So we want to make this as flexible as possible and also as easy to use for users. So it needs to make a business case. Okay, it needs to make a business case because it's a great idea, but how do we intend to sustain this? So from the conversations we've been having with various partners, we noted that university research projects would definitely benefit from this. University commissions, regional and national patent agencies, legal patent firms, we are literally crossing over into industry, citation databases, cultural heritage organizations, museums, NRENs, and research councils. So this is where we are. We have 3 phases, and we are going through the project sector, the project setup. We are coming up with strategic partnerships and product development. So we are looking at a 10-year phase with the potential of breaking even by phase 2. So each phase is made up of 3 years. So we started in May. So right now we're in October. So we've been fortunate to get some use cases for this, for the project we're working on. And the use cases we've got are from universities, legal firms, and national patent registration agencies. And as I wind up, this is not only a continental problem, it's also a global issue. And as you can see, the impact we are trying to make covers the 5 SDGs. So quality education, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and partnership of the goals. But the ones that connect to Agenda 2063, that is the Africa we want, that is our continental agenda, is with aspiration 1, where well-educated citizens and skills revolution underpinned by science, technology, and innovation, and where we are using world-class infrastructure to crisscross the continent and improving our knowledge economy. Thank you so much.
But if you have them, please. No? Okay. Save them for later.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Joy.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So we're going to move on. Hopefully our magic slide guy will zip us forward to the right slide, because we're going to hear from Helena. Yeah, there we are. So we're on the menu. So we're halfway through, as you can see. Global Access Initiatives. We're going to hear from DataCite and ORCID. Just to call out for the collaborative notes, take a look at also people in the room. If you want to take a look at there and take some notes or complete the Mentimeter poll, please do. Helena, welcome.
Thank you.
Helena, she leads the DataCite engagement team. I'm sure many of you know her. Her background is actually in neuroscience, and before joining DataCite, she worked as a product manager in research data management, and she lives in the Netherlands. And maybe you didn't know, but she has 2 kids, 2 dogs, and 2 horses. So, Helena.
Thank you. The dogs are actually here in Salzburg, but I left the kids and the horses home. So, can I get to the next slide? Or yeah, oh, excellent. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm so happy to have the opportunity to discuss this topic here today, because this is, I think, one of the main things that I'm working on right now at DataCite. This is a very important topic for us. So it's really great that the PID interest group decided to make this the topic of this year's session. Yeah, so I guess probably by now we're getting towards the end of International Data Week. So you probably already know what DataCite is, but just in case, We're a global community that shares a common interest to ensure that research outputs and resources are openly available and connected so that their reuse can advance knowledge across and between disciplines now and in the future. And of course, for the purpose of today, the emphasis is really on global community. And we are already a global community. We have members in over 50 countries, but we still felt that we could do more because there are still regions and countries that don't have access to our services to the same extent. And so we wanted to start addressing that. So therefore, earlier this year in February 2023, we introduced the DataCite Global Access Program. And we started talking about this early in 2022. And yeah, we were very lucky that the Global Access Program was made possible by a grant from CCI that enabled us to launch the program. And it's obviously always quite hard to decide which regions are in scope. So we decided to keep it quite broad and focus on Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and actually South Asia is not true, Asia. I don't know how that ended up on my slide. The way we developed the program was that actually we established a member model advisory group early in 2022 with members from all continents to hear from them. Do you think there are challenges that need addressing? If so, what are those challenging and what could be potential solutions? And so we spent several months with that group really thinking through that and trying to hear from our existing communities, leveraging those to really understand what we could be working on. And there were three things that came up. Oh, it looks like my slide shifted a bit with the transition to PowerPoint. No problem. Yeah, so there were three things that came up in those discussions. And really, I would say the number one thing that the committee told us was that outreach, community building, community awareness was the main thing. Really talking to local communities, learning from the stakeholders about existing practices, the needs. And so the committee said that is number one. You know, there's not sort of one quick fix solution to engage a broader community. You really need to be out there, you know, have those conversations and have that understanding. Then another thing that came up was technical infrastructure, because of course you can say, hey, here are some DOIs, but if the underlying infrastructure isn't there, you don't really benefit from having persistent identifiers. And so that was really important to also look at where do those infrastructures exist, what's still needed, how can we work with existing local infrastructures, and how can we help organizations get to a point where they can actually benefit from DOIs. And then another aspect was to look at providing some of the funding to actually get to that point. And so one of the first things we did was actually establish a team to think about this, because we thought it's very important to have people in and from the regions working with the communities and thinking about this. So my colleague Gabby is leading the team. And then we have 3 regional engagement specialists. We have Mohammed, who's based in Dubai, responsible for the Middle East and Asia. We have Bozoon in Africa, based in Nigeria. And we have Arturo, based in Mexico, working with the Latin American community. And so, yeah, as I said, we launched our program in February this year, and we really sort of define some goals for the initial year, to also for us really gain an even better understanding of how can we engage and what can we do, and what's needed. So our 3 regional engagement specialists started with a landscape analysis for all the different regions, seeing what was already there. And yeah, we're close to wrapping those up. We'll be posting those to Zenodo so that everyone can see what we found in these analyses. We're working on some best practices from some of our existing members there to sort of show what can be done, what's working well for them. We're already having many conversations with organizations in the regions, setting up collaborations. We're close to launching an ambassadors program, and related to the best practices, making some case studies available. Then on the infrastructure side, the landscape analysis also includes an analysis of the infrastructure landscape, use of particular platforms and service providers. That's what SP stands for. and seeing how we can work with them, and having user groups that can benefit from each other's experience. And then, yeah, funding also came up in these discussions. It wasn't seen as the main thing, but still obviously an important thing. And so we were really happy that we got the chance also with this grant to explore setting up a global access fund. And so that's also something we did this year. We made a global access fund available. It was really established to enable communities worldwide to make all research outputs discoverable, because in the end, that is really what we're trying to do here. And I think Jonathan said that as well in his introduction. The reason to think about this is to really connect all global outputs into that research graph, into the research ecosystem. And so, yeah, we had a call for proposals a while ago, which closed just last week. We're now in the process of looking at all the applications that we received in different categories. So for outreach activities, for infrastructure activities, demonstrator activities. And we're hoping to take a decision early December so that these projects that are selected can be carried out next year. And we're really excited to see what will be done and what that will lead to. So yeah, that was a really exciting development this year as well. And really our goal is, if this is all successful, to be able to continue doing this, so have another round of global access funding next year. So that's something we're working towards. So yeah, as I think probably is true for all of you, we really want to work towards an equitable and inclusive research ecosystem. And that's why we established this program. And yeah, happy to talk more today with all of you, and happy to take questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, thoughts to share? Do we have any online? Well, you know where to find us. Wonderful. Thank you, Helena. So next up, we have a virtual participant. So we're going to have you bear with us slightly while hopefully our guys in the back can open the video up for Paloma from ORCID. She's the engagement manager for ORCID. Her background's actually in physics and information science. Before she joined ORCID, she was an information manager for persistent identifiers at the Technical University of Vienna, so not too far away from here. But now she's in Barcelona and she's joining us from Barcelona. She would have been here in person, but happily and wonderfully, she's in the last trimester of her pregnancy. So travel is definitely out of it. But she's online, hopefully. Are you there, Paloma?
I'm here. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, fantastic.
It works. Fantastic.
It does. And our AV guy at the back will advance your slides, but you'll have to do it old fashioned. So just tell him next slide, please, like we used to.
I will do. And I hope that anyone is annoying with that. So thank you very much for the introduction, Jonathan. And also I wanted to highlight that my presentation today, and actually the program that I'm going to introduce, won't be possible without my colleague Lombe Tembo, who is basically responsible for the program and for managing our RDs. And I will mention more about that in the coming slides. So also similar to what Helena was saying, I assume that by the end of this week, you already are more than familiar with ORCID and know what ORCID is. But I wanted to highlight the mission of ORCID, considering those transparent and trustworthy connections between researchers and their contributions. And here, regardless where they are and at which point of their scientific career. So next slide, please. But this, regardless where they are, is sometimes a bit difficult because of the lack of global participation in some areas, not when it comes to researchers per se, but when it comes to organizations supporting all those activities. Next slide, please. So we basically turn global participation into one of the main topics in our strategy for 2022 to 2025. You can read this strategy online, and here is kind of a general idea of what we mean with increasing that global participation in terms of organizations that are using the ORCID infrastructure to exchange data with ORCID, and that can benefit also from reading data from ORCID and having their researchers well identified. Next slide, please. So here is what you can see in terms of adoption. So both for researchers, where we have researchers everywhere in the world, actually, and currently with almost 10 million active records. And what we call active are those records that are used. So either for single sign-on, or they exchange data already with another platform, or they use one of the claiming systems, etc. On the other hand, you see that when it comes to member organizations and adoptions, there are a lot of regions that are still with low or no participation, even though the amount of organizations that are currently ORCID members is about 1,300. Next slide, please. So a potential solution for this is what we call the Global Participation Program, similar to the Global Access Program that Elena was presenting. And next slide, please. So basically, the Global Participation Program has two phases. One is what we call the Membership Equity Program, which are involves some adjustments in our existing membership program when it comes to ORCID consortia. And on the other hand, we have the Global Participation Fund, which is divided into two parts. On the one hand, community outreach, so that communities in the focus areas are motivated to talk more about ORCID, persistent identifiers, and create actually that community of practice. And on the other hand, we have the technical implementation. So basically, how systems can be better connected. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the community development and outreach part, we basically have like twofold approach. On the one end is building the community, and on the other hand is supporting those communities. So the local outreach, training, technical support, with the end goal of having that well-established community of practice. And on the other hand, the technical integration grants are divided into three blocks, so to say. This can be to build integrations with the ORCID infrastructure, also to build utilities, so create or improve existing open source components that can facilitate that ORCID participation and those connections. So for example, an open source repository, or an open source data repository, or an open source journal platform. And then the part of supporting use, which basically is related to the technical documentation of the above integrations and the outreach in a technical sense. Next slide, please. So the structure of the program supports different grantees, and we have now 2 grants cycle per year. One is always in April, and the other one is in October. And we grant approximately 5 grants per cycle. So at the moment, we have one cycle with 5 and another one with 4, and I will mention more about them later. And each grant is from $5,000 to $20,000. And for grantees, what they have is dedicated ORCID staff, who is my colleague Lombe, as mentioned, and she follows up once per month with every single grantee. And of course, there is a grantee community and also an ongoing communication program. Next slide, please. So, as mentioned, we have 2 cycles per year. So the first cycle was granted at the end of last year, so December 2022. And in this one, we had 4 community development and outreach grants with EcoConnect, CLISC, Africa Archive, and the Virtual University of Côte d'Ivoire, and one dedicated for technical implementations, which in this case was a combination between the Technical University of Hamburg and For Science to further develop the DSpace CRIS ORCID integration. And something that I forgot is that the institution that applies for the grant can be in one of the focus communities or not, but the result of the grant has to benefit the focus community. And next slide is about the second cycle that we had also, well, this year as well, earlier this year. So it started in April and was announced, the results were announced in July. And in this case, we had 4 community and outreach grants focused on ITOCA for training and outreach in Africa. Then also Indonesia, India with InfluentNet, and Indonesia with PKP and the implementation of OGS and the community of practice there, and also Sri Lanka with further analysis of the situation in the country. Next slide. And the third cycle is open right now, so you're still on time to apply. The application goes until Friday next week, so the 3rd of November, and there you have the link to register. But also, if you go to the ORCID page, you will see there on the resources the option Global Participation Fund, and then you will find all the information, including FAQs about the grant and general information about the project, how it is funded, and how it is developed. Next slide. Of course, this is not the only thing that is related to global participation and that adoption, right? It is a part of that. But we also thought of facilitating adoption via our regional consortia. So up to now, we had only the option for one country to form a consortium, so for a national community of practice, but now we expanded the idea into a regional one. Next slide. Why we did this? Because basically we were facing some problems with that consortium approach. One consideration was that not all countries have either sufficient resources to take that regional support or national support, better say, or an enough number of organizations that are research focused. So sometimes what happens is that 1 or 2 organizations covered, particularly in small countries, all the research that is performed in that country. So some countries might not have that number of organizations in order to form a consortium and benefit from having that community of practice. So what we decided is to establish a regional consortium approach so that different countries in one region can basically join together and form their own community of practice. Next slide. We've started this with a LATAM consortium, which is coordinated from Colombia, but includes also members from other countries in Latin America. And we are hoping to have more in other regions following this approach. We have also considered some conditions for those consortia, and they need to include members from low, middle, and upper middle income countries, considering the World Bank classification. And we always consider the classification when a country has been there for 2 consecutive years. So if some countries might fluctuate in their classification, so we always wait until they have been 2 years in the same. We can't have a consortium that has 85% of their members from the same country to facilitate basically adoption, representation, and the own sovereignty of each country. And basically what we say is that the initial number of organizations should be 5, and then 10 members from the second year onward. And there in the footnote, you will see the link about the regional consortium in case you would like to know more about that, or in case you can think of having one for your institution or planning one for your region. And with this, I finish my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I think there is another slide for thank you. And of course, you can always contact me or my colleague Lombe if you have further questions, either from the consortium approach or for the grants and global participation approach.
Great, thank you very much, Paloma. So let's see, it's 3:10. I want to leave a little bit of time for a discussion at the end about the future of this interest group. But we have a little bit of time, maybe. I don't know if you want to, do you want to come up to sit up here and have it, or do you want to do it down there with a microphone? No, come up and let's showcase you. Go in, Chama. Yeah, please, if you would. That's another opportunity for you to ask questions and also people online. I'll try and keep track of it. And Laurie will do too. Oh, there's a microphone. There you go. So I was trying to reflect on this and think, actually, we've got a kind of a two approach. We've got a bottom-up approach. So that's what we heard from Joy and Tiamo of initiatives in Africa that are bubbling up that we can support. And then we've got, I think, it's probably not a character, but your efforts, the ORCID and DataCite and actually Crossref have something else, I think, called the Global Equitable Membership. And they seem to me all about lowering barriers and getting more people involved as a fundamental issue. So we've got a bottom up and a top down, which I think is way more than, if I go back to when Josh did the study for Freya, that's already lots more than has happened in the past. But my question to you is then, what's missing? What is there a missing link? Is this the way we should be going? Is there more that we could do? What else? Really, the question we have. Actually, could you put the slide one more on, just so we all see it? It's an open question, really. Is what more can we do to help or to do initiatives? Helen.
Well, I guess this is no.
Yeah, no, it is.
Yeah, I think this is working now. Yeah, well, I first wanted to say that if I gave the impression this was something top down, that was definitely not the impression that I wanted to give, because I think what we're doing is very much something that's coming from the communities that we're already working with. And by sort of listening to them and working with them, we're trying to figure out how we can improve that access and participation. So I don't think there's necessarily a gap in the middle somewhere. And I mean, for example, DataCite is also talking to Joy. So I think there are already many conversations taking place to bring all of this together. And yes, there can always be more, of course, but I definitely think, and as you also said, we're already so much further than we were a couple of years ago. So I very much feel that we're on the right track with the things that are happening.
What I feel needs to be done is increased capacity building, especially from the HR perspective. So we need more people familiar with persistent identifiers, different types of persistent identifiers, so that we can break conversations that are biased. We end up having much more informed conversations on persistent identifiers and how they can support various aspects of the research life cycle. One size does not fit all, so they need to know what works best for them. And also what we are seeing in the continent is that we need more professionals who will be familiar with scholarly infrastructure, because the reality is we are all talking about open science, open infrastructure, and we are struggling to get professionals who can manage this. And I say this even amongst the librarians, we are seeing that good example with our project, we had to train our tech team based on what we were learning from the DOI Foundation and the Donor Foundation, and also with the kind support of experts. Yes, all of them are African, but most of them are not based in the continent. They've been fortunate to have access to these resources outside the continent. But what does that say? We need to build those capacities internally within our universities, because yes, we have a lot of data science programs, but they don't come in for scholarly infrastructure. They go straight to industry. So if you're raising money, we need to look at how we can apportion these data scientists to work with NRENs, to work with university libraries, so that we can build a pool of specialists, data science specialists who are familiar with scholarly infrastructure, because we really do not have that in the continent.
No, thanks very much, Jonathan, for that. I think it's a multifaceted topic, and there are many aspects to this. And I think from the African perspective, the data is there. I think what is required is the necessary instruments and roadmaps to be able, for example, to make sure that the research infrastructures that collect information about various aspects in the continent have got a mechanism, for example, making those data sets available. And then, of course, we know that, making data available obviously requires what technical all of you are talking about. But I think at a very, very high level, we need to start making sure that the data is made available, that talks to repositories. And you can only have these things if you've got the necessary policies institutionally, nationally, to say, look, we need these things. And I think from a technical point of view, as a computer scientist, I know, from the very early days of URLs, now we are talking DOIs, we're talking about identifying services. I think we do need to make sure that we have open standards, not a plethora of standards where everybody's driven by their agendas. Let's agree. We want to identify where the data is. Let's have those, I would say, community-driven standards, sustainable models that will probably in the long term allow us to work together. And I think it's very, very critical also within the discussions that we're having, creating a global ecosystem of open science clouds. We're in China 2 months ago, where we did agree that these platforms have to engage probably over some projects that we can use to coalesce around and exercise some of these things. So really for me as a computer scientist, having gone through the 90s where we talked about open source, we talked about open standards, I still to see this vision being really attained. So really I'm pushing for open standards. I'm pushing for equity models. I mean, we talk about equity. Let's identify where the bottlenecks are. What are the bottlenecks to equity regarding persistence identifiers? And we have specific interventions that will try to plug those equity gaps. So I think probably Joy knows better about what it costs to access DOI services. But I think long term, let's make it more easier than not to be able to use this thing. Thank you.
Paloma, I think you wanted to add something.
Yes, sure. So basically, I think that one main point that we always need to focus on when it comes to global adoption is that we focus on infrastructure that are open, so open source infrastructures. And if we basically analyze what's been used for repositories, what's been used for data repositories, for publishing platforms, then we basically see that the adoption in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, is basically based on open source solutions. DSpace, Dataverse, OGS, Invenio, etc. So keep focusing on integrating persistent identifiers in a good way in those platforms, in those type of platforms. And also on the other hand is listening to every single community, basically because sometimes we might present things in a way that either isn't appealing or isn't understandable, not because of the lack of capacity, but because of the lack of exposure. So sometimes as Joy was mentioning, there might be spots in other countries that are exposed to that knowledge, and then they can bring that knowledge back. But it is also building capacities within the community, and also listening to the community. Maybe something that is presented isn't clear or isn't applicable to that region or to that context, and then be flexible enough in order to be able to adapt that to every single local context.
Great, thank you. Are there any comments from the audience? I have some reflections, but open it to the audience. Matt.
Yes, maybe just interested, Joy and Shama, specifically, I guess we're talking about kind of capacity, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt from DataSite. We are very mindful of saying we want to come and train and work with communities because we don't understand needs and the challenges. And so what can we do to better support you in building capacity around your needs? And I think often we talk about these technical solutions. Oh, it's really easy. It's open source. Just set it up, spin up a server. And I'm from South Africa originally. And I'm like, well, load shedding and like all of these challenges, like, there's, so how can we better, is there a forum or any thoughts around how we can better help support that capacity? Is it that we need to get the global community rallying around funding to drive these programs and policies forwards? Yeah, just interested in your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I always get a little stick.
Oh, sorry, I switched on.
I always get a lot of stick out of this to say that I think often we put the cart before the horse. I think the issues are high level. There's no way we can discuss all these issues without making sure that at a very high level, we agree as Africa or as countries that we need policies to overcome all this. And the university can, of course, do an open science policy at an institutional level. If South Africa has not approved and ratified South African open science policy that then talks to how we do all these things, it's going to be tricky. Of course, you can have bottom-up approaches. I would argue we need very, very strong, robust regional open science frameworks that are then translated to national instruments. And then, of course, those instruments will guide what is required in terms of infrastructure needs, what is required in terms of the data repositories, data centers, and the sustainability for doing those things. Of course, as individual researchers, we can play around with these things, but I think on a national level, we need these strong instruments. And I would argue that the data is there. It's also very important for us to highlight what data sets we are ready to make available and discoverable. And as communities then talk about, as communities of practice talk about how we want to go through with the verification process, which will then talk to issues of DOI. So really it's a multifaceted issue. For me, I think where we are, it's not a race, it's a marathon, isn't it? Let's make sure that we start properly. Often you want to join the bandwagon, not to be left behind, but I don't even know when people have arrived because you haven't defined what arriving means. So I think for us, just to answer your question, we need a robust engagement with those that can provide the scaffolding policy frameworks, recognizing that we have ratified the UNESCO recommendations, and then say, look, what are we going to do in the next few years as continents? Because I think these strong policy frameworks will then inform the necessary investments. Technical matters, I believe, are not the main issue here. Some of the discussions on DOIs has gone back as far as identifying HTML pages on the internet. Of course, we've added multiple layers on them. My PhD was on distributed systems in terms of multi-agent systems. We talked about uniquely identified agent services. So some of the technical issues, including what you're discussing, really are not intractable. I think for me, really, let's elevate the discussion, let's support this work in terms of high-level policy issues. Thanks. But of course, capacity building. As ASP, we're very, very keen to work with those that are looking at engaging to elevate everybody else's awareness, supporting, for example, we talk about research data, capacity building, and these issues. We'll be very happy to join with yourselves. to be able to run training sessions across our network that could sensitize stakeholders on some of these matters. Thank you.
Just emphasizing on what Shiamo has said, from a practical perspective, if you're looking at the regional partners, policy partners you could work with. In East Africa, we have the East African community through the East African Science and Technology Commission, and that is directly reporting to the East African Parliament that is pushing for open science, regional open science policy in Eastern Africa. So you're looking at 7 countries. In West Africa, we have ECOWAS, and these are partners who are already working at a regional level to include open science policies at a regional level. So you're looking at about 13 countries in Western Africa. And of course, the regions are unique in their own way and with their own challenges. But yes, that is a very fast, practical approach on how you can work with them. And as Shiamo said, AOSP, but also our regional consortia, like the library consortia. You know, we have IFLAND and there's also AFLIA. These are partners who are really trying to make sure that these activities on open science, especially on the capacity building, the awareness, are done. But yes, we need to start at an open science level. Oh, and before I forget, the Science Granting Councils Initiative. We are coming into Africa. It's a good thing you're from South Africa, so you're familiar with the ecosystem. By the time, for those who are non-Africans, by the time you're bringing in funding in Africa, it's important to work with the stakeholders who are already contributing to supporting the ecosystem, especially the funders. So we have the Science Granting Councils, and that is one way to give you access to all the countries that have at least committed 1% of their GDP in higher education. So that's 16 African countries. It's better than nothing. And those ones are creating frameworks in open science within the countries. So through those stakeholders, you have a better chance on how you can do a map on how you can do the activities within the continent.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I think we have to bring the session to a close. I've got a couple of reflections. One is when you said about capacity and knowledge, it reminding me back to when we talked in this interest group about persistence. And one of the things we said was we can do great things in technical persistence, but it's a lot of know-how actually that's embedded in the systems that Matt or other ones run. And I think it's actually a common problem of how do we share the knowledge between the few people here who know an awful lot and more people. So I think actually that's maybe an area of connection that we have. And then talking about connections, I thought the thing about integration, your model of bundling identifiers into a bucket to match them and crosswalk them. I think that is something, and I know that's something that certainly Crossref and DataCite and ORCID have worked on, but how we connect the identifiers, because there will always be many identifiers because that's the way humans work. But I think if we can work on connecting them, that makes a lot of sense. That's another thing that I think we can take for the interest group. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, our panelists, and Paloma online.
Thank you very much for having me as well.
So we've got 4 minutes left. Could you just put the next slide up, I think? Yeah. Or no, let's do the first one. Next one, sorry. No, you don't know. Oh, sorry. I released you from your obligation. Next one. That's it. Great. So last chance to fill in the, well, not the last chance because you can do it. We'll leave it open for another day. But please do pass your opinions. We're going to try and pull up the results so far, but I'm not sure. I embedded it in the PowerPoint, but it didn't work when we loaded it. All right. As we're doing that, Laurie at the front here, this is our opportunity to say goodbye and thank you to Laurie. She's been co-chair of this interest group ever since the beginning, 10 years. And it's remarkable what's happened over those 10 years. So huge thank you to Laurie. Thank you. And I'm really pleased to welcome the immediate replacement, as if by magic, Josh Brown, who's sitting over there, who's going to stand right now. There's Josh. Welcome to Josh. So as soon as I tell RDA, then we'll switch your names on. And thank you so much, Josh, for agreeing. That was it as far as I'm concerned. Please. take us through it.
So it's a quick survey. It would be fabulous if you could complete it. Can't do it right now. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to talk into the microphone. So quick survey. We're basically just trying to figure out for the people in the room, how many sessions have you attended? And so that helps us give us a beat on what's happening next year. The next question is the kinds of conversations that are most helpful to you. So PID provider updates is one idea. We've done in the past, RDA working group updates from other groups that are doing persistent identifier work. Discussing ideas for new PID working groups is not really, we just talked about that a little bit today, but it's not been something that this PID has done very much. So it's nice to see that's at 3.2 right now. It looks like, Jonathan, this idea for topical conversations is really what is working for people, which is awesome. And there's an other, and I know the other has no field to fill in. So the next slide was really intended to capture your other ideas. And for whatever reason, the comments aren't showing up here. There's a little spinny wheel, but we have the comments on the slides. So yeah, we're just going to keep going. There's another one. Should we continue the PID? Let's go. And there's a resounding yes with one no. So, you know, add some more yeses or make us all feel good or not. I mean, if we shouldn't, we shouldn't. But right now it looks like the overwhelming number of people say we should continue. And then this is another spinny wheel. The next slide is some specific comments on how we could best serve you guys. Like, how can we make sure we're providing content, et cetera, that is meeting the needs of the community here at RDA? So I think that's where we end right there. So thank you. And if you haven't filled it out, fill it out. And thanks, Josh, for taking on as co-chair. I appreciate that. It's awesome. And
Okay.
all right, yours are way bigger than mine. All right, here you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, that's it then. Let's close. If we've just hit 3:30. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your attention. Thank everyone online. Don't be strangers. Contact us. If you're not a member of the interest group, then please join, and you can contact us that way. And safe travels home. Thank you.